Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, and I am the Marketing Communications Manager for Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers, so please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. We serve a very broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Today we are thrilled to introduce Rob Hanna, President of Precision Content Authoring Solutions. Rob is an expert in structured authoring and content management. He holds a designation from AIM.org as a Certified Enterprise Content Management Specialist and is a named Fellow of the Society for Technical Communication. Rob is a member of the Oasis Data Technical Committee and an executive member of the first Canadian chapter of AIM in Toronto. Rob's company employs a team of skilled information architects and technical communicators that help organizations make their information easier to use. Without further ado, welcome Rob.
Thanks very much, Adam, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. So just a really quick introduction into who Precision Content Authoring is. That was a good introduction. Thank you, Adam. We do provide full service in terms of helping companies with their information, right from content strategy straight through to publishing solutions. But at the core of what we do, we are content transformation specialists. So we have a little bit of a latency, it seems, on the slide deck. So please let me know if I'm getting too far ahead of myself. But core to who we are is our content strategy and how we help clients understand the depth and breadth of the problems that we're trying to solve for them. So part of our content strategy consists of three specific pillars around content utility. In other words, how useful is the content in the form that it is. Content maintainability in terms of the process around the content and how it needs to be maintained so that it stays sustainable and accurate over time. And then finally, the key part for us is the usability, and that's where our precision content writing methodology fits into our overall offerings for precision content and our content solutions, working with our methodology and adaptations and specializations to the Data XML framework. So enough about being about us, and on to what exactly it is that we're talking about. So today we're talking about metadata and how it's related to content. And I myself am my qualifications for this particular presentation are that I'm one of only a handful of people in all of North America who tend to get disproportionately excited about metadata. So I've been working with it for quite some time. It's very much part of what I've been doing. It's been a big part of my career as a technical communicator and information architect over the years. But first of all, let's put this into context. So we're talking about metadata. What is it applying to? Well, it applies to content. And what are we talking about when we're talking about content? So we look at, for instance, information within the enterprise. We look at data as a single point of information about something that's managed within the enterprise. as we aggregate more data together, we compile information, and information is what the company uses. It's what's produced through its information systems for information-intensive businesses. But content is how we interpret that information, and we package that information for our customers, internal and external, on how to interpret that information that we produce or that we manage. And then from there, we're able to take this content, or our users, our readers, are able to take that content and apply their own context to it in order to extract knowledge from that content. So really what we're talking about today is metadata and how it relates to content that we produce and we manage within our enterprise. So metadata, as defined, was coined back in the 1960s. And its textbook definition right now is as simple as data about data. Of course, that's about as useful as stuff about stuff, really, isn't it? I mean, it's not very descriptive as to what it does. So maybe a more elaborate explanation would be to say that it's essential properties, usually structured within the context of external content, to identify and define information about that content. So metadata is information about a resource, and it's as simple as talking about the resource, a metadata property name, and a value. This is, in essence, what a piece of metadata is for intensive purposes that we're talking about it today. So metadata, it's applied to all structured and unstructured content within a corpus. It can be visible or hidden from view. So by definition, we like to think of metadata as always being under the covers and behind the scenes. But a lot of times, this metadata needs to be surfaced, and it will be published, it'll be visible, of course, when this information is published. A perfect example of metadata that's also visible is, for instance, the title of a document or a web page, where the title is metadata, but it is also content. So it serves two purposes within our content as metadata. It is both machine-driven or it is manually entered. So the best metadata is the metadata that we don't need to rely on authors or users or contributors to actually enter into the system, but that can be derived from the tools and the systems in which that user is operating. This metadata is internal or external to the content, meaning that either the metadata is stored in the content itself, or it is stored externally in typically a relational database or some other database that is then tied back to that content. Metadata can be mandatory, optional, or conditional in nature. So where we force metadata and we force users to enter metadata, it's obviously mandatory. Optional metadata is, and then conditional metadata is where it starts out potentially as optional and then it becomes mandatory as a piece of content moves through a workflow or through a process, or it meets a specific condition where metadata is required to be entered. So there are many forms of metadata, and of course it is structured data about content. It will be either relational or hierarchical and can take many different forms. So anything from rich text or binary or even images through to syntax encoded values, where we provide or where the system provides additional validation of metadata upon entry by matching up with a specific type of syntax encoding, whether it's date, time, or it's social insurance or social security number, or it's a zip code or something to that effect, where there is a specific formula or a template for entering data. So many roles of metadata. Of course, the primary role of metadata is to facilitate identification, retrieval, and processing of content. That's its primary goal, but it also has two other secondary but very important roles, which include content and acting as corporate structured data. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So we talked about already how metadata can be content, such as title or even author or other pieces of information about the content that you're looking at that's also stored as metadata and used by other systems for other purposes, for retrieval, search, etc. So one of my favorite metaphors for metadata to really understand what it is a soup can, where metadata is the soup is the soup can, and the content itself is the soup. So there's a lot of information, of course, that we can get from the soup can that we obviously can't get from the soup, but that it helps us to identify and also manage this particular product through its life cycle. And of course, metadata isn't the message. In fact, what we're looking at here is the metadata behind a Twitter message. So while the Twitter post is only 118 characters, the actual metadata message itself is almost 2,000 characters in length. Now, when we talk about why metadata matters, um, there are some nefarious aspects to metadata and how metadata can be and is used by organizations. If we think about what metadata is and how it's stored, as we say, it's highly structured and it's very reliable data about content. And so therefore, metadata is easier to manipulate, easier to store, search, filter, and organize than the content itself. So sometimes we can get more information about the information from the metadata than we can easily define or derive from the content itself. And in a recent presentation by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, there were concerns in Australia where there was talk of capturing and storing metadata about cell phone messages, whereas the actual messages themselves or the actual voice messages were not to be stored, but the metadata itself was to be stored and to be retrievable and used for anti-terrorist types of activities and other types of policing activities. And it really opened up a severe can of worms. So some of the examples that they pulled out were situations where, for instance, they know you rang a phone sex service at 2:24 and spoke for 18 minutes, but that's not incriminating, as they certainly don't know what it was you talked about. Or calling the suicide prevention hotline from the Golden Gate Bridge. Of course, the actual call itself, nobody knows what you actually talked about. And then this one, where the phone metadata shows that you spoke with the HIV testing service and then your doctor and the health insurance company, but probably nothing to worry about there, right? So now we get into the actual classification and definitions around metadata itself. So at its highest level, we look at dividing metadata into three very distinct categories of descriptive metadata, administrative metadata, and structural metadata. So descriptive metadata is the metadata that we most often work with, whether it's as authors or contributors or information architects. This is metadata that we need to be able to set up so that we're able to identify and quickly retrieve information based on what the information is about. And typically, only an author or a content contributor can apply this descriptive metadata appropriately. So therefore, the systems and how we work with this metadata has a very it's very important to understand the various systems on how we gather and manage and deploy descriptive metadata. So one of the first, I've got one exercise here that I'd like for you all to walk through with me. And really what it is it's about thinking about how we classify information on a daily basis. And by the end of this, I hope you'll see that how we set up and how we establish metadata is very important to the effectiveness of the metadata that we're going to be working with. So if you would all consider, please just take a pen and a piece of paper, and we're going to go through, like I say, a quick exercise. And what you're going to see in a moment are a series of 21 words. And you'll have 20 seconds to just stare at the screen and try to memorize as many of these words as possible. Please don't start writing down the words until the words actually disappear from the screen. Once you're done, we're going to count and see how many words that you actually remembered correctly from this screen. So I'm going to just click, if you're all ready now, please with your pens down. I'm going to click this button and you'll have 20 seconds. Okay, so if you'll all pick up your pencils, please, and take 20 seconds to write down as many of those words as you can remember, please. Okay, so for our first survey question, I'd like for you to, Adam, if you'll bring up the survey, I'd like for you to please enter into the poll how many of the words you were able to recall from that list.
So Rob, with about 60% of the attendees voting, we have 43% have said 6 or fewer, 38% said 7 to 9, and 18% said 9 to 12. And we're
Wonderful.
about
Wow.
80% of the attendees have voted.
Okay, excellent. And sorry, how many were in that first category again?
44% at this time indicated they've memorized 6 or fewer words.
Okay.
Then 36% at 7 to 9, and 19% saying 9 to 12.
Great. Well, that is actually really quite typical of this particular exercise, where people will remember, and it looks like about 75% of the folks remembered, around 7 to 9, or around 7 or 8 words from that list. So what I'm going to take you through now are the processes in which we use to try to classify that information in order to be able to work with it and retrieve that information. So first thing that our minds try to do when we're looking at these words is that we need to try to filter out all of the noise. So you're going to look at those words and you're going to say, wow, that's a really nice font, and why is that red, and this one's bigger than that one. What significance does that have in the word? When of course there is no significance to the fonts or the colors or the size or the boldness of the words. It's the words themselves that are important. So the first thing we have to do in order to start to work with this information and store and retrieve the information is to filter out all of the noise. The next thing that we do in our minds is we try to break this information out into smaller groupings. visually so that we can retrieve this information and work with the information. And then next, we're looking for relationships between these words. How do these words relate to each other, and can I sort them into by similarities? And once we're looking at how they're sorted by similarities, then of course we go about attempting to label those similarities so that we can better recall and work with that information. So here are the words that were presented to you earlier in that earlier slide. So have a look and see, of those words that you wrote down, how many of them were actually, did you recall correctly from this list? Okay, so probably a couple of the words at least that you have on your list, if they're even on this slide, you may have had a memory recall error even in some of the words that you did recall. So now we've taken this information, we've categorized it, we've filtered out all the noise, we've put labels on it to make this information easier for you to recall. So we're going to do this exercise one more time, except we're going to have already put this together for you. And let's walk through this one more time, 20 seconds, and see how many words you can memorize now from the next list. So once the words disappear from the screen, start to write the words down for me, okay? So pens down at the moment, and here we go. Okay, now let's take 20 seconds or so to write down as many of those words as you possibly can remember. And we're going to run that poll again. Okay, and Adam, can you, okay, so here are the words. So pens down, here are the words. Let's go through the next survey question and see how you did this time. Adam, would you please pull up the poll once again?
So Rob, with about a little bit more than half of the attendees voting, we have 41% indicate 9 to 12, 35% 7 to 9, and 20% 11 to 13, and we're about 70% of the attendees have voted.
Wonderful. So we can see a very, very obvious difference in what our brains do to try to work with and organize this information. So all of those four specific steps of trying to filter out the noise, break into smaller groups, categorize and label, these are all things that we do every day when we're working with information. And it's no different than when we're working with metadata and trying to organize logical metadata schemes for our users. Being able to anticipate how the user is going to be able to work with and remember data and work with data is critically important to creating a good metadata schema. So it starts with controlled vocabularies. Coming up with proper controlled vocabularies, or even adopting existing controlled vocabularies for metadata, is essential to success. So with controlled metadata, of course, we can create pick lists for values, lookups for values for when users are entering metadata to reduce or eliminate errors or inconsistencies that would otherwise be introduced through free text fields for metadata collection. So metadata controlled vocabulary is obviously a list of terms. And controlled vocabularies actually are quite common within industry where you can either get controlled vocabularies free or for a fee. You can pick up actually massive controlled vocabularies that you can adopt and use within your organization rather than having to try to reinvent the wheel. So we see problems with controlled vocabularies in the workplace and with metadata all the time, where there are ambiguous terms or multiple terms meaning the same thing. Coming up with a way to be able to distill this information into a single piece of information that we can otherwise then relate data to. So, and there are many different ways to manage and control these controlled vocabularies, starting with, of course, controlled lists and looking at increasing complexity through authority files, taxonomy, and eventually to the more complex of the controlled vocabulary schemes, the thesaurus, where we can relate similar terms and even antonyms to words within our controlled vocabularies, such that when similar terms are used, we can create associations and link content together by virtue of a thesaurus, and also using a thesaurus to not only link content, but to bring together content through full text search. Next, we look at moving into different types of classification schemes. So the three primary classification schemes are by subject, by organization, or by function. So subject is probably the one that we're most familiar with and tends to add the most value when it comes to being able to organize and retrieve information. Unfortunately, it's also one of the most difficult and most expensive to build and maintain. Once it's done, however, the stability of the subject taxonomy is far more stable than the other two of function and organization. So this is an example of a type of subject classification where we can relate different terms, or different, in this instance, different types of beer, how they relate together into broader categories and into subcategories. Next is organization classification. Now this is one of the easiest types of classification scheme to develop. There can be very little argument as to how your organization is structured, so therefore there's very little that's required in terms of gaining consensus when implementing an organizational classification. And of course, within our workplace, most of our shared drives and network resources are all based around an organizational classification rather than subject or function. So while they're easy to make, they are also very, very easy to break and change very frequently. So they're not as reliable, certainly in the long term, as our two other types of classification schema. So functional classification is really your happy medium, all right, where it's sort of halfway between subject and organization, where we're really talking about organization by function, activity, and task within an organization. So hopefully your company or organization have repeatable processes or repeated functions that they participate regularly with, and that even if the company becomes or reorganizes, that these functions remain stable over time. It doesn't give us the same depth and concise retrieval as subject-based taxonomies, but again, it's easier and less expensive to develop than subject-based taxonomies. So, taxonomies. There are several different types of taxonomies that we see regularly and work with on our different information systems. And so let's walk through some of them. So at its most basic level, you have your list style taxonomy, where it's simply a flat file of controlled words that often can be organized into alphabetically or otherwise to organize data or controlled vocabularies. So this is by far the most common type of taxonomy that we use for metadata. And of course, we'll all be familiar with the simple tree style taxonomy. Of course, this is how our shared drives and network drives are structured. You can think of them as a tree style taxonomy. And I'll show an example later on about how we use these simple tree style taxonomies to create and manage metadata within a CMS system. Then we start moving into more complex but rigorous types of taxonomies necessary for managing highly complex information for more accurate retrieval and processing of information. So we move into something such as the classical hierarchical style, where there are very specific rules around how information is subdivided as it moves deeper into the tree type of taxonomy. So with a simple tree type taxonomy, how information is subdivided or metadata is subdivided into categories can be rather arbitrary. And you can in fact have the same term showing up in multiple classification areas within a simple tree style taxonomy. Now with a hierarchical style taxonomy, the idea here is that every piece of data has a single home and a single facet on which it can be classified. So you won't find the same metadata or the same data being classified more than one way. Of course, this gets turned on its ear a little bit in the real world, where we're forced to look at information through a different lens, where in the real world, data isn't simply able to be classified along a single branch, where we're talking about polyhierarchical style taxonomies. Now, while these reflect the real world, they also present real problems for information systems and for architects to try to implement meaningful taxonomies. More typically, we'll see matrix-style taxonomies where we create multiple facets in which to categorize information to be able to more accurately search for and retrieve and process information in our enterprise. And probably one of the more obscure but still classified as a taxonomy type is your system map style taxonomy. So here, for instance, I have system map. It is a metaphor of a subway system representing different types of CMS systems and vendors and how they relate to each other. But we could just as easily be looking at a map of the human body or human anatomy showing the different parts and relationships and classifications of the different types of organs or tissues or muscle groups within the human body as a form of taxonomy. So those are all descriptive metadata. The next type of major classification of metadata is the administrative metadata. And in large part, administrative metadata is metadata that's applied through systems, whether it's automatically applied by your file system or by a CMS, or it's metadata that's triggered through a workflow or process by a CMS system. So as content moves from one state to another state, as it gets approved or becomes archived, or while something moves from being unclassified to classified, we rely on our systems to apply and manage this administrative metadata in large part. So the administrative metadata is metadata that's necessary for managing the content through its life cycle, ensuring that it's handled properly and only the right people can see this content at any one time. So a lot of times we'll find that administrative metadata is not embedded or attached directly to the content itself. And it is in fact external to the metadata and linked to the metadata through a CMS or through other relational databases where that status metadata is maintained. And finally, we get into structural metadata. Structural metadata really is about defining the structure of the content itself. So at a very broad level, we are talking about how organization or how the content is organized into a book, a document, or even a website. But more specifically, when we're talking about structural metadata where it has specific meaning to us is in the structural metadata that we find within structured content itself. So many of you may already be familiar with what XML is and how XML works, but I just want to walk you through what it is that we're talking about and develop a deeper understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about structural metadata. So of course, XML has been around for quite some time, and it is an open standard managed by the good folks who bring us the World Wide Web. And it is everywhere and everything. It's under everything we work with today. So XML itself, we would find is, of course, under the covers on our cell phones and smartphones and tablets and websites. And it's even under the covers with Microsoft Word, Access, Excel. Everything uses XML under the covers. But most of the time, this XML is concealed. We don't see it. It's hidden. It is truly metadata, but necessary for having content flow from one point to another. So we talk about XML. It's extensible markup language. So what are we talking about really when we're talking about markup language? While we were certainly thinking of the electronic age, they really predate electronic publishing. And what the markup does is it tells computers how to handle or render data. Of course, pre-desktop publishing, we used markup to tell desktop publishers how to lay out our manuscripts for publication. So an important distinction that I want to make, though, is between the two classifications of markup that we refer to. So we have presentation markup and semantic markup as being the two broadest categories of structural metadata within XML. So with presentation markup, we're marking it up for how we want it to be published. So in electronic terms, we might mark it up such that we're identifying a paragraph of information and we want to italicize certain pieces of or phrases or words within that paragraph for presentation. So this is very typical of how the web-based content works. We lay content out for presentation purposes, and then our web browsers take this HTML and they apply style sheets to this presentation markup to know how to render it on your machine. The next one, however, is semantic markup. And this is really where I start to get excited about metadata, is where we're not looking at content and how it's marked up for presentation, but how it's marked up for meaning. So in this case, we take that text and we identify what that content is rather than how that content needs to be presented. So we've taken that previous paragraph and we've identified it as an introductory paragraph. We've identified that first string as a citation for a magazine, and then of course where we had the italics before where we wanted to italicize all, what we're really trying to say there is we want to emphasize all. So we're marking it up for meaning rather than for presentation. And of course, we apply style sheets to it, and the rendering engine renders it much like it did previously as italics. So it looks the same, but it really isn't the same. It's got so much more behind this now because we can identify content for meaning rather than just presentation, such that we can take this and we can do all sorts of different things with this semantic markup. As an example here, I might take that citation and link it to a magazine database, which then returns a URL that will take the reader from this particular page to a subscription page or to a library page where they can look up a specific article on the web. I can change emphasis from being italics to being bold. There's many different things I can do because I've marked up this content semantically. So with semantic markup, we can easily disambiguate content, search based on meaning, connect to other content, and reuse or substitute new text because we are using semantic markup. And with this semantic markup, of course, we also get the benefits of potentially multi-channel publishing, where we can take content and we can support all different types of output from this one source. So here we're talking about data XML specifically. As we move forward, and what we're really talking about here is intelligent content, which has been, of course, a staple for technical publications now for quite some time. Really, this has been brought to light and by Anne Rockley and really adopted as gospel across many technical publication organizations. But more recently, other parts of the enterprise have started to take notice of what intelligent content is, and most recently, the content marketing association has purchased the rights to Anne Rockley's Intelligent Content Conference and adopted it as their own. And now they're espousing the virtues of intelligent content for marketing content within the organization, where they're only now starting to learn about the power of semantically rich, discoverable content and the value of putting that effort into semantically marking up the structure of that content early when the content's created rather than trying to enrich the content afterwards, which of course leads to all sorts of other problems. So I've walked you now through the three main types of metadata, from descriptive to administrative to structural. And now we have a few minutes, so I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples of how we need to better manage our metadata to help facilitate accurate metadata and exchange of metadata. So the first thing I want to show you refers to the interoperability of metadata and tools within your organization. And just with a quick demonstration, we're going to start with a Word document here. So I've set up a bit of a template here, and I'm going to go ahead and just start so you're asking, why am I writing a document? This is a seminar about metadata. What's going on? Well, you'll see momentarily. All right, so I'm using features within Word, very normal features of using fields, which of course then take this metadata, which I've written as content, but take that metadata and apply it across the document. So we see the document title, date, and I'm going to put status in here. I'm going to change the status here. Approved. So while as an author, I think I'm just authoring a document, I'm doing more than that. I'm also entering metadata about this document that the system can now use. So when I go and I look at the properties in this particular document, I can see I've got the title, I've got the author, which was written in by the system, got the subject, company. So a lot of really good metadata has been picked up by the system. So administrative metadata, descriptive metadata, which is all well and good. And of course, many of you have I've seen this many times before. But let's see what happens to that metadata as we start to move it through different systems. So when we move it into, for instance, PDF, so here we go. Here's the PDF that we created. Let's see how much of that metadata actually got moved over to the PDF. So we see it brought over the title, it brought over the author, it brought over the subject, which was the subheading in the previous document. So it doesn't look like it quite brought everything over, although it did bring over the company name, Precision Content, and the date that it was modified, which is very good. So we can see that it brought it over. It relabeled some of this metadata, interestingly. It brought over some metadata that we didn't even necessarily expect that it would bring over. So that was very good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our content and we're going to push it up to SharePoint. Oops. Oh, stop that. Sorry. I love live demonstrations. All right. Okay, so this is a great document. Got pulled up. That's great. That's what I wanted to see. I just have to check it in. And now let's have a look and see how much metadata came across from this particular document. This is a great document here. All right. All right, so what I can do in here is I can actually go in and I can change what I can see in this particular library. Sorry, I need to go to the documents library here. That's right. All right, where I can now see the different fields that has come across, and from here I can see the approval status come across, the titles come across, the authors come across, but not all of the other data has come across. Interesting. So when developing metadata, it's important not just to come up with the proper metadata fields and processes, but also it's important to consider what tools you're using and what tools are in the chain, all the way from content creation to management to publishing, to ensure that metadata persists across all of the various systems so that it's consistent and it doesn't become disconnected or disparate from the original single source for the artifact or for the content. So understanding all the tools in the chain and how they handle it is an important consideration. Next, when we look at, so we saw how SharePoint manages metadata, and actually SharePoint handles metadata very, very well with its term store and other features. You can develop very sophisticated metadata management schemes, and of course some very excellent plugins. But we look at, for instance, the CMS. we look at our EasyData CMS. We're looking at the next gen product from EasyData. Here we've got the ability to get pretty deep into working with complex taxonomies that we can then use for classification of our content. So I haven't got a very big one in here, but just for demonstration purposes, we can see that we've broken information down into different types. So we build essentially a tree-style taxonomy that we can then apply to content within our repository for retrieval. So when we go back to the repository, and we go and we start looking at some of the content in our repository, we can do things such as apply filters based on these facets to be able to easily search and retrieve information within our repository. So, you know, what's very important here is that we've got tools in the chain that we can use and pass information into the CCMS and then pass it through to publication as well, so that we can maintain consistency of our metadata across the chain. And with that, that concludes my presentation, and I think we're ready to go to any questions. See if we've got any questions lined up. Adam?
Well, thank you, Rob. Very informative webinar indeed. If you have any questions, please, you're welcome. If there are any questions, please put them in through the chat area right now. In the meantime, while we'll wait for some, here's the first question. Rob, the first question is, for a Word document that has embedded visual drawings, any idea what metadata properties get associated to this embedding, and if SharePoint search gets to pick it up?
Embedded drawings in Word documents, what metadata gets associated with it? I think it would depend a little bit on what the object is that's being embedded, because different objects would have different metadata behind them. What gets picked up specifically or can be extracted in SharePoint natively, I don't think that data can be extracted natively by SharePoint itself, but I would think that it's likely that there would be utilities that would be able to extract a certain amount of metadata from embedded images. But if you'd like to follow up with me after the session, I can have a look to see what I might have to be able to help you with that.
Great, thank you, Rob. The next question has come in is, what about keywords is metadata?
Keywords, very interesting. So without a controlled vocabulary, keywords are very difficult to manage. So in most instances, keywords are not controlled. So they have somewhat limited value in terms of being able to search and retrieve content. So I think so long as you can create a controlled vocabulary for your keywords, you'll get what you expect. When they're uncontrolled, it turns into more of a almost a folksonomy, where content is classified by various authors. So better than nothing, certainly, but not nearly as powerful as working with a controlled vocabulary.
Thank you, Rob. The next question is, I've been reading lately that XML is becoming passé on the web. Can you comment?
Oh, passé on the web. Certainly HTML5, there's a lot of talk about how it is the semantics in HTML5 are supplanting semantics in XML schemas such as DITA, but I would hesitate to say that it's passe, but yeah, I couldn't comment beyond that.
Well, thank you, Rob, for that.
Uh-huh.
Um, just give it a couple more seconds to see if there's any other questions that come in, that will come in. In the
Mhm.
meantime, I just wanted to let everyone know our next webinar will be Wednesday, September 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Introduction to Structured Authoring. It's being presented by Rob Hanna, who's presenting today.
Mhm.
And with that, and the last question has come in is, can you address the differentiation between internal metadata, SME names, and external metadata keywords?
I'm sorry, could you read that again, please?
Sure. Can you address the differentiation between internal metadata, parentheses, SME names, close
Okay.
parentheses, and external metadata, parentheses, keywords, close parentheses?
Internal, external metadata. So I think the question that's being asked is metadata that's used for SME names, which is almost administrative metadata, used for managing the content lifecycle, and metadata that doesn't get passed through necessarily to the end consumer. So the end consumer would have no means of seeing SME names as metadata on content, whether it was content that passed through workflow or CMS, versus keywords, which are intended for publication. In other words, they're intended to enrich the published content to facilitate easier search and retrieval. So I would really differentiate those two as being more descriptive versus administrative metadata.
Great, thank you.
Mm.
The next question has come in is, any thoughts on ontologies and
Mm.
data model standards?
We've got a minute and a half, so yes, ontologies, of course, are are a monster. They're really um, related to taxonomies, certainly, but very specific. Now, there's a lot of power in ontologies. They're difficult to build and maintain, and there's just not a lot of information systems that easily integrate ontological data into publishing. I know there have been a few tools that have attempted to merge RDF and OWL based ontologies into XML content. Very powerful idea, but with um, just not a lot of consumer buy-in in the marketplace. So I think there's a lot of room to grow into ontologies, and particularly as it comes to associating ontologies with structured content. But it requires a lot of processing power and a lot of sophistication, and not just the tools, but the people creating the content and managing that content and assigning values from an ontology to content. So a lot of power, but I think we're still a ways away from seeing it leveraged effectively.
Great, thank you, Rob. And the last question, the last and final question is, out of curiosity, what is a synonym ring? It was on one of your slides.
Okay, all right. A synonym ring is simpler than a thesaurus, but it basically it does not establish a preferred term, simply that relation to other words that are synonymous. So the synonym ring simply does exactly as it says. It says this word is related to this word as it's related to this word as it's related to the other word. As we move into more levels of sophistication, we need to define what the preferred term is and how those other synonyms are related. And with the source, we can add in other types of relationships other than exact synonyms. So words that are similar in meaning or even antonyms. I hope that helps.
Great. Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. This concludes today's broadcast. You can access the recorded version from our from the webinar archive section of our website located at http://www.dcllab.com. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great day.
Thank you.